For most of recorded history, the story of the Haudenosaunee seemed pretty much settled. Better known to a lot of people as the Iroquois or the people of the Longhouse, they were this incredibly powerful confederation of nations governing by consensus right in the forests of present-day New York. I mean, they built longhouses stretching hundreds of feet, projected immense political and military power all across the Northeast, and were absolute master diplomats and nation builders. The Europeans who first encountered them basically treated them as a permanent, static feature of the landscape. It was as if they had just always existed in exactly that form. But here's the thing. It turns out the standard textbook origin story is missing a massive, scientifically backed plot twist. So in this explainer, we're going to completely pull back the curtain on who the Haudenosaunee actually were before the Confederacy. Okay, let's dive into this. The standard version of history usually tells us that sometime before European contact, 5 distinct nations, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk, just suddenly came together, buried their weapons beneath a great white pine, and formed a confederacy. And while that political alliance is a true and undeniably powerful story, it's really only the final act. The textbook narrative kind of implies this sudden emergence of a bounded, permanent nation. But the scientific reality, which archaeology, linguistics, and modern genomics are just now revealing to us, shows us something entirely different. We're talking about millennia of in-place evolution, continuous integration, and deep, deep fluidity.
So let's start by unearthing the real timeline in Section 1 and look at the actual archaeological evidence we have today.
Instead of a sudden arrival from somewhere else, Northern Iroquoian-speaking peoples have roots in the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence Valley, and upstate New York that stretch back not centuries, but millennia. Between 500 and 1000 AD, small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers were slowly starting to settle down. Maize agriculture was spreading north, and that allowed for denser communities. By 1000 to 1200 AD, archaeologists like Dean Snow at Penn State have tracked how local pottery styles diversified across dozens of generations of continuous local production. And then, by the 12th and 13th centuries, things scaled up drastically. Excavations by the University of Toronto and the Rochester Museum show massive, triple-walled, palisaded villages housing over 1,000 people. Literally, imagine the sheer logistics of building something like that without modern tools. These weren't built by a group of people who just arrived out of nowhere. They were built by a population that had grown and intensified its agriculture over many, many generations. And what's really incredible is how the language actually mirrors the physical evidence we're finding in the dirt. Linguists have reconstructed what they call Proto-Northern Iroquoian. This is the common ancestral language of the Mohawk, Seneca, Huron, and other related peoples. And they've dated it back to roughly 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. The way these languages diverge doesn't point to some dramatic migration from a distant homeland. Instead, it points to a fascinating, gradual, in-place differentiation. The people were already there. They were just becoming distinct from each other slowly over centuries, all while staying closely connected through trade and intermarriage. Which brings us to Section 2, the genetic fingerprint. Let's see if the biological data matches this timeline by looking at permeable boundaries. Genomic analyses, like those published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, have fundamentally dismantled the whole bounded nation model. You see, European ethnographers love to draw hard lines on maps, but ancient DNA, it shows that those boundaries were completely ignored by the people actually living there. The lines were highly permeable and constantly crossed. There was persistent, sustained gene flow between these Iroquoian populations and their Algonquian-speaking neighbors. There is absolutely no moment in the genetic record where the Iroquois somehow crystallized as a distinct, isolated biological population. The distinction between them and their neighbors was linguistic, it was cultural, and it was political, but it was never cleanly biological. Which leads us to a massive cliffhanger of a question. If human biology and DNA didn't create a unique Iroquois identity, what on earth actually held the 5 nations together? How did they manage to become one of the most sophisticated political systems in the pre-colonial Americas? That perfectly sets up Section 3, the politics of grief. This is where we dive into their astonishing cultural mechanisms. So the answer to our question isn't in their DNA at all. It's right there in their radical cultural practices. Let's look at the Great Law of Peace, and specifically something called the Mourning War. When a Haudenosaunee community suffered losses, whether that was from conflict, disease, or just old age, that grief wasn't just a personal, family matter. It was a structural crisis for the whole community. The dead left literal gaps in kinship networks, in clan obligations, and in the entire social architecture of the Longhouse. So how did they fix it? War parties would raid neighboring peoples and bring back captives. But here is the key. These captives were not enslaved. They were fully adopted. It's a radical rethinking of restorative justice and community building. They healed the grief of a lost family member by fully adopting someone from a neighboring group. These captives were given the names of the dead, completely absorbed into families, and granted full membership and a voice in the community. Their children were Haudenosaunee. Their grandchildren carried absolutely no mark of foreign origin whatsoever. And you can actually see this adoption process happening right in the patterns of their pottery. Researchers at Cornell and the Canadian Museum of History have documented these sudden, abrupt shifts in styles within single villages. You'll have decades of really consistent ceramic traditions, right? And then, boom, new forms and decorative patterns just appear out of nowhere. These aren't just trade goods. They are the actual material signatures of adopted women bringing their specific craft knowledge into their new households and blending it perfectly with existing practices. And incredibly, because these villages relocated every 10 to 20 years as their firewood and soils depleted, every single new site became a time capsule, a snapshot of this beautifully blended material culture, reconstituted by these newly integrated members. This practice was so intense and so common, it actually shocked outsiders. Jesuit missionaries living among the Haudenosaunee in the 17th century recorded this entire process with sheer astonishment. Just listen to this unbelievable observation from Father François-Joseph Lemercier. He wrote, "Entire communities sometimes consisted of more adopted foreigners than people born into the nation." The actual numbers from the mid-17th century are just staggering. After the devastating epidemics of the 1630s and 1640s, where European diseases wiped out massive portions of the population, this adoption process kicked into absolute overdrive. Thousands of Huron, Erie, Neutral, Susquehannock, and Algonquian people were absorbed. By the 1660s, some communities were sitting at roughly 65% adopted members and only 35% born into the nation. Just imagine that for a second. Imagine standing in a longhouse council, surrounded by people speaking 3 or 4 different mother tongues, born into nations the Haudenosaunee had previously fought, who are now raising Haudenosaunee children and governing with full authority. The identity holding them all together wasn't inherited, it was chosen, and it was deliberately constructed. And that brings us to our final part, Section 4, the open longhouse, and the intentional design behind this incredible society. You see, the Haudenosaunee oral traditions never actually described their origins as pure. The Great Law of Peace was never about purity. In fact, the metaphor of the longhouse itself, with its doors open at both ends, was never just about architecture. It was a core statement of their political philosophy. The house was always designed to grow, to adapt, and to bring new people in. And this is exactly where we have to fundamentally reevaluate how we look at history. The Western fixation has almost always been on bounded origins, right? Finding that single moment and single place where a pure people began, relying on clean biological categories. European scholars looked for a rigid genesis point. But the Haudenosaunee reality was a continuous flowing process. As the DNA, the archaeology, and the linguistic reconstructions all confirm, this was a society built not through isolation, but through centuries of deliberate inclusion, adaptation, and just brilliant political imagination. Incorporation wasn't just something that happened to them. They made it the very core principle of their governance. The clean categories and bounded nations we so often read about in textbooks are usually artificial constructions placed over a reality that was, frankly, messy, entangled, and constantly in motion. The Haudenosaunee prove that a powerful identity absolutely doesn't require a closed biological loop. So, it leaves us with this profound thought to ponder. If human identity is naturally fluid, entangled, and constantly in motion, are bounded origin stories, for anyone, anywhere, ever, really true? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the narrative, and I'll see you next time.